In the previous video, we spoke about why you need to do risk assessment and what is the basic principles of doing the risk assessment, the context, the risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation, and then the risk treatment, and we do it in groups for the benefit of two heads being better than one, four eyes being better than two, to be able to see them, and we also want to use this as a learning opportunity. We are going to be following a technique that was developed already in the 1970s, and you will see similarities of this to what we call the Swiss cheese model and Frank's bird model and so on. It's called the hazard barrier target approach. The idea behind the hazard barrier target approach, when we want to brainstorm our hazards for risk assessment, is based on the principle that there are hazards that want to cause harm to the target. Now, these hazards can be tools, equipment, procedures, animals, all those kind of things. And the targets are typically our production, our finances, the people that work for us, our safety, our bodily security, and so on. So there are things that can get harmed by the targets if they get the opportunity to contact with them. And what we want to do is we want to put up shields between the hazard and the target as protection mechanisms. And these shields can be 3 or 4 layers or 6 layers, or however you need to make sure that these hazards, their targets and their swords, their dangers, their teeth and their claws cannot reach our targets. So we've got hazards with energy that can harm the targets. We've got the targets over here, and then we've got the barriers and the controls that we put in place. Let's quickly look at the definition. What is a hazard? Well, everything that can get close enough to a target so that it can actually make contact with that target is a hazard. And it must have energy, the bottom piece, it must have that energy, the ability. What is energy? Energy is the ability to do work. If you get up in the morning and you are very tired, you will say, "Oh, I don't have energy." In other words, you don't know how you are going to get your work done for today. If you run a long distance and you use up all your energy, then you will eventually collapse, like some of these athletes at the Comrades. They will collapse at the finishing line because they have no more energy. They don't have any ability to do any work. If I throw a ball to you and you are standing too far away from me, the ball will not have enough energy to reach you, and it will fall somewhere between you and me. It will fall on the floor. So I can't hurt you with the ball if I throw the ball at you, if I can't hit you with the ball. And for the ball to be able to hit you, it has to have enough energy that I put into it so that it can travel the distance, have closing potential between you and me, and then when it hits you and the energy is spent and it hits you softly, it will not cause harm. But if you stand close to me, or it's a ball that's got a lot of energy and it touches you on the other side and it hits you hard in the face and your nose starts bleeding, then this ball had enough energy to do harm, to do work, to change something when it gets there. Okay, so a hazard is everything that can get close enough to a target, and it must have enough energy to do harm when it reaches the target. What is a barrier? A barrier is anything that we put up between the hazard and the target. And that can be something physical, like a shield or a PPE or a fence or a guard or something like that, but it can also be a procedure or a rule or a traffic sign, right, that changes your behavior so that you don't come close enough that the hazard can get you. It's like at the zoo, you've got lions or animals inside the zoo. Inside the cages, there are barriers between you and the animal. If you go to the zoos, you'll see that they've got a big trench, they've got a wall, and they've got a big, nice fence with strong wires. And there's a sign that says, don't get over the fence, don't put your hand in there. And yet still some people don't listen. So a hazard, anything that can get close enough to touch the target and cause harm. It must have energy to do harm when it gets there. The target is anything that may be harmed by the hazard: people, animals, property, your reputation. Barrier is something that you put in place to keep the hazard and the target apart. Most of the time it's passive. Passive means it's not it's just sitting there and waiting, and like a barrier and a fence and a PPE. It doesn't physically do something until something touches it. And then a control is something that we put in place to prevent the undesired effects to the target. Now, those are the difference between a barrier and a control. Is a barrier is passive, just sits there, and a control is something that has to be done. It's either a guard or a hooter or a procedure or something that people have to do. Okay, and here at the bottom we just talk about the closing potential. So hazard, barrier, target, and then energy, ability to do work and harm, closing potential, I must get close enough to you. Now, how do I identify hazards? We say a hazard is the source of harm. Without a hazard, there can be no harm. Now, the picture here shows a knife, an angle grinder, a nice angry bulldog, and there's a cracker or some dynamite there. Those are all examples of hazards that if you get close enough to them and there's energy behind them, whether I throw the knife or I use it forward and backwards with my hand, or whether you fall onto it, or if I push it into you or into an object, then it will cause harm. It will cut you. If I put it in the drawer and I can't get to it, and there's nothing that makes this thing move towards a target, or there's nothing that makes the target move toward the knife, that knife cannot do any harm. But it remains a hazard, all right? Because if I give it energy and I touch a target, it will do harm. The same with the angle grinder. The angle grinder's got certain properties, and gravity, the fact that it can fall, gives it some energy, that what we call the potential energy from gravity. If I put electricity on the back and I make that disc spin, I give it energy, and if I then touch something, it will cut it, it will cause harm, and if the disc then breaks, it will also cause harm. That bulldog, if it's in a cage behind a fence, it's got the potential to cause harm because it can run, it can move its jaws. It will bite you. Not necessarily will bite you, but it can bite you. But if you stay behind the fence and the bulldog stays behind his side of a fence, it doesn't have closing potential, cannot get to you, can bark and growl and threaten you as much as you want to, but if it can't get to you, it cannot hurt you. That dynamite or the cracker, there's a lot of energy in there. If I hold it, or if I'm close enough to it for the shock wave, or things get blasted towards me, projectiles, then it will have closing potential, and if that stuff hits me hard enough, it will cause harm. But if I stay far enough or I hide behind something, it cannot touch me and it cannot cause harm. All right? So it has to touch me and it has to have enough energy when it touches me to cause harm. If this knife is not, if it touches me but it doesn't touch me hard enough, it's not going to cut me. How do I find these hazards? I've given you some examples now of some hazards. We are going to use our 5 senses. And some people say women have got a 6th sense. And some people also brag they've got a 6th sense. If you have, you're welcome to use that. I don't have one, so I will only use 5. Those 5 senses are sight. So I will look for things. I will smell for things. Unfortunately, there are some hazards like gases and stuff that are odorless, that you can't smell them, so you will not pick them up that way. But I will use my nose and I will try and smell hazards. I will use my hearing. I can hear something making a noise, something approaching me. I can hear something rumbling. I might even taste things. Sometimes this is not recommended, especially if you don't know what you're tasting. But yeah, sometimes when we eat things, you can taste that this is not so nice. This is not in a good shape anymore. And then I can say, this is not healthy for me, and I will take it away because it's rotten. And I can also use touch. Now, once again, touch, all of these senses. If you use them in the wrong place, in the wrong way, if you touch something that's too hot, it will burn you, or you can have electrical shock, or you can have a chemical burn. So you have to be careful, but you will have to use your 5 senses. A hazard is everything that I can observe through my senses. Everything. If I can observe it with my senses, it means that it's there. It's a physical thing, and it may cause harm to me. I haven't evaluated yet. I have just identified it as a hazard. We will analyze it and evaluate it a bit later. But everything that I can see, if I'm entering the door of a building, if I'm standing in front of a building, and I see the building and the door and the steps, those are all hazards. They are part of the building, but they may cause harm. I can slip and fall on the steps. The door can close on my fingers. Door can close in my face. Windows I can bump at a window and it can crack and it can cut. Okay, things need to happen for me and for the target and the hazard to close on each other, to touch each other, and it has to have energy, as I said before. But I must identify everything that I see, hear, smell, touch, and that I can taste. Unfortunately, like I said already, some hazards I cannot detect through my senses. They are too small. Things like what we call pathogens, viruses and bacteria. You cannot see a COVID virus. You cannot see a flea virus. You cannot see a cold bacteria. You cannot see a malaria parasite. All right. You cannot see carbon monoxide, which is a colorless, odorless gas. And those things are still hazards. They still exist. I can maybe not see them with my 5 senses, but I can use gas detection equipment. I can use microscopes, and I will still see those things. I will be able to detect them. They have to be physically there. If something is not physically, if it doesn't physically exist, it cannot be a hazard. So for a hazard, everything that physically exists. Everything. I'm not saying that every hazard will kill you, but for every hazard, something, if it interacts with a target, something may happen. Where do I get this knowledge? Well, I need to have some technical knowledge of hazards, because some of the hazards may be created by things like combustion, CO2, There may be chemical reactions. There may be decomposition. If you work in sewers or those kind of things, decomposition of organic material will create methane, which can explode. It will create methane and hydrogen sulfide and carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide gases, which will kill you, and you cannot necessarily always see them. All hazards have physical forms and properties. And that's where people make the first mistake. When I ask them to do hazard identification, they give me bad behaviors, rules that are not being followed. They give me incidents. All I want is a list of physical objects which we can see or which we know they are there that I can detect. Those are all the hazards. If I ask you, what is the hazard, and you say, that guy is not wearing his PPE, that's not a hazard. What I want to know, if he is not wearing his PPE, what is going to hurt him? Is it going to be noise? And if it's noise, where does the noise come from? If it's dust, what kind of dust is it? And where does the dust come from? If there's a chemical fume, I want to know what kind of chemical fume and where does the chemical fume come from? What kind of chemical is it? PPE, wearing PPE is a control, it's not a hazard. Not wearing the PPE is not a hazard. It's a control that is not working because your operational discipline is not good. If you tell me a guy wasn't trained to do this, that is not a hazard. The training is done to help the guy understand how he needs to deal with the hazard. In other words, if he's not trained to drive a vehicle, what is the hazard? The vehicle is the hazard because the vehicle can then bump into people or drive over people or so on. The bad operator is just the guy that cannot control it. And the training that I give to the driver is a control to make sure the driver can operate it. But the hazard, the thing that causes the harm in the end, is the operator. If a person is doing unsafe, or there's a trip and fall, he's going to trip and fall on the floor, I want to know what he's going to trip and fall over. That is the hazard, not the trip and fall. Okay. Or you're gonna tell me this is a hazard, he's going to get a first aid case. What is going to cause the first aid case injury? That's the hazard. Is it the knife? Is it the cracker or the dynamite? Or is it the bulldog? Or is it the angle grinder? I want to know what the hazard is. Sometimes people talk about a potential hazard. Now, I've just said that a hazard has to physically exist. Now, in English, the word potential means that it is not yet. It will come, or it can happen. Now, a hazard has to be something physical. So if there's a potential hazard, means we still have to make it. And it's just the way that we speak sometimes. And what I want to say, the hazard has got the potential to cause harm. And now I incorrectly use the word and I say it's a potential hazard. A hazard is, or a hazard isn't. Okay. If there's no hazard, then it's a potential hazard and then it cannot cause harm. So please, a hazard that physically exists has the potential to cause harm. In other words, there is a possibility that it may cause harm. But there's no such thing as a potential hazard. There's risk, and risk is something that may happen in the future. Here's your first exercise. This is a workshop, and there are people working there. What I need you to do for this assignment is to list all the hazards in the picture. There are quite a few of them. Don't tell me about the rules that are getting broken. Don't tell me about the incidents. I want only the hazards.